everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. This is the Banned Books Podcast, episode number 140-something. What
144.
144. I hope that you are all safe. I hope that you are all well taken care of. I hope that we're recording this on Monday, June 1st, which means that the aliens are going to come back and unleash the dinosaurs on the population.
Kind of hoping for that.
You know, at this point, it's like I posted yesterday, they found that cave with like 33 different species of creatures that have gone undiscovered.
Oh.
And the response was, not this year, man. Not this year.
I missed that.
Put them back.
It's like, I told Ann, you know, that military declassified that UFO footage a couple weeks ago. And she's like, what?
Yeah, no one cares.
Yeah. No. They said, yeah, we have UFOs. We don't know.
Yeah.
We have no intelligence on these.
Over the weekend, Tesla made NASA incompetent, but obsolete. And no one cares.
No, well, NASA wanted to be. Like, we can't do this anymore. So, here, somebody else take over.
Anymore? Elon Musk has done more in 8 years than NASA has done in the last 40.
Yeah. Well, and he shamed Boeing, too, which is pretty incredible.
I know he did. It's fantastic. I love it.
Maybe Boeing will step up. We'll see.
But yeah, I mean, today, this is the thing, is that as of June 1st, 2020, our country's on fire.
Yeah.
And I'm
big cities anyway.
I'm 40 miles south of Minneapolis where this all popped off, where George Floyd was murdered. Oh, I'm sorry, killed.
He died.
Apparently, I'm not supposed to say he was murdered by a police officer.
Well, the autopsy. But yeah.
Well, don't even get me started. They're bringing in Jeffrey Epstein's coroner to do the independent autopsy. And I haven't talked to a single person on either side of this debate who thinks that's a good idea.
The optics aren't good.
This is Minnesota in a nutshell, though. Like my friend that I train with posts every day on Instagram, 5 days without incident, scratch, 0 days without incident. Minnesota, just
take the sign down. Yeah.
You know, like I posted this morning, you elect a clown, expect a circus. And our leaders are morons with bad ideas. I mean,
you're not picking on one particular one there.
No. And I think I was talking with another friend of mine that I train with, and he's got a background in political science, and we were conversing about how what COVID and now this has really revealed is the level of incompetence of the people that we've elected to represent us.
Yeah.
They've been, but I said too, to add to that, I think we've all been unmasked because in the past 72 hours to about 4 or 5 days since this popped off in Minneapolis, I have had friends that I never thought I would hear say things about race where I just went, well, we can't be friends anymore because that's unacceptable. It's uncritical. It's just obtuse. And yet on the flip side too, people that I never thought were going to show up and speak up did. And I've been super impressed with that. And at least where I'm at then, one of the things that we've done is opened up our house and our church to friends of mine who are around the 3rd precinct and the 5th precinct and who rightfully so are worried because their streets are literally on fire. And now we've got Antifa coming from out of town and possibly white supremacist groups from out of town, but also from within the state to be specific. That's the problem too, is that at least in Minnesota, there are messages being spun by our politicians, by the governor, by the mayors, and by the media, which should come as a shock to nobody who thinks critically or questions what they're being told. That also then adds to the sense, not of fear, but of anger. That one thing that's impressed me here anyways, is that millennials have really stepped up actually. And not only have they primarily preached a message of unity, and this isn't black versus white, this is about justice and injustice. This is about racism versus those who are against these kinds of systemic racist enterprises, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And something that I don't think I've heard the media or these politicians grasp is that the millennials and the Gen Xers in particular are hip to this, that you are telling us that there's systemic racism in this state and in the police force in Minneapolis, for example, and yet you are at the head of those institutions.
Right.
You are literally the ringleader of the system that you're calling racist.
You're the ones who had the power or opportunity to bring correction.
Right. It's like I pointed out that the mayor of Minneapolis likes to come on TV and act like he's going to cry because he's so sympathetic to the plight of the people that are protesting. And yet I point out he's the one who ordered the police to shoot rubber bullets and tear gas at you.
Yeah, right.
Like that's like the buck stops with him. So maybe it's more difficult for people to focus on what's being said when it appears that a leader, whatever that leader may be, a community leader, a politician, religious leader even, when they get to the podium, they get to the pulpit, they get to the mic and they cry. It's moving, it's emotive. But if you listen to what they're saying and you listen to their behavior after the fact, the same politicians that cry at the podium are also the ones who say, if you go outside without a mask on, I will have you arrested and fined $1,000.
So they were authoritarian in one respect.
Up until the entire population of Minneapolis essentially revolted against them, they were heavily on the side of authoritarianism.
Yeah.
It's like I said, last Friday, my governor could care less about our constitutional rights.
Right.
All of a sudden, now he's all for freedom of assembly and freedom of protest.
Right. Or racial inequality or income inequality.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny how this works.
Which, of course, contributed to this. I mean, you have a social, economic...
Of course it did.
Component that unfortunately is... It meets some racial profile. Right. I mean, there's in Minneapolis, St. Paul, I think the stat I saw was something like, median household income disparity of $45,000 annual between black and white homes. You say it's not a black and white issue, and yet there is a radical different way of life.
Well, this goes back decades to the red line. It's not a law, so to speak, but it is a law. It's an ethic for sure that you draw lines around certain neighborhoods.
Oh yeah, we had that in Chicago too.
Well, any major city that I've ever lived in has an MLK Boulevard that separates the city into quadrants. North, south, east, west. So you usually have a highway that runs right through the middle of the town.
Sounds like Berlin post-World War II.
It kind of is, though. Like when I lived in Portland, Oregon, MLK Boulevard divided the city in half. And then the highway that ran the opposite direction divided it into these four quadrants. And, of course, where Concordia University was in the worst part of town.
Yeah, right. Cheapest and worst.
Exactly. That's why. It's the cheapest part of town. But that's why when I was at Concordia St. Paul and Concordia Portland, because I double dipped on bachelor's degrees, we were instructed the first day during admissions counseling, don't leave campus, don't be wandering around the neighborhood after 9 o'clock at night. In both places, I was told this. And unless you go to Seward, I think Concordia Seward's in the middle of a cornfield.
Pretty much.
And Concordia Mequon is actually a really nice campus, but that's because it's not in town and they took over a nunnery.
Right. And it's high income, largely white neighborhood.
But by and large, you see this where I've lived at anyways. I've lived in Louisiana and I've lived in Oregon. I've lived in Mexico, in rural Mexico, where I've seen real crushing poverty.
Yeah.
And that's not just generations, that's hundreds of years of poverty. And so this isn't something that just happened, and it's not a millennial issue. It's not a Gen X issue. This is decades and decades and decades in the coming.
Well, I made a comment to my mother. We were just chatting back and forth about, she was watching the footage online and whatnot. And I just said, no, she's like, well, what can we do? And I said, nothing.
Right.
I mean, it's not, I know we'd like to fix it. We can't, it's not a fixable situation. Not just because it's systemic, right? I mean,
right.
Or deeply ingrained.
Right.
Well, actually, that's part of it. Especially as a nation.
It is. It's a part of America.
Yeah, and we never really got over it. I mean, I suppose we found ways to deal with it, but that idea of like racial inequity, I mean, it's international. It's everywhere. You think China and Korea or something like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's human nature. That's original sin in a nutshell, is that we find something about the other that is different than us, and then we exploit that to dehumanize the other for our own benefit.
Well, we talked about this even being in the church,
right?
Between the churches that Paul founds, and
well, that's MLK's point, right?
Yeah.
Well, MLK's point is that Sunday is the most segregated day of the week.
The black churches and the white churches.
Yeah, absolutely, especially
Korean
in the South,
church
right?
And whatever. Yeah.
But to this day, it's that way.
Well, you're around like-minded people.
That too. That too.
Same. It's not just color of skin, but
right. Well, it's Aristotle. Like attracts like.
Yeah, you're going to sing the same kind of things. You have the same kind of heritage, so you're going to have the same traditions.
But I was going to say, even going back to the colonial period, one of the things that the plantation owners would do is to give to quote unquote free men, a mule and a bag of grain, and send them out to the frontier, which is usually the Appalachian Mountains at that time, to serve as a buffer between their plantations and the Indians.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because they understood at that time even the best way to protect ourselves is to let these people go out there and homestead and fight it out with the Indians so that we don't have to have them coming into our fields and into our front yards.
Well, and it wasn't that there weren't conversion to Christianity, but it was broader than just conversion to faith in Christ. It was actually a cultural conversion, right? Well, you've got to be like us and have economic systems like us.
We saw this with German imperialism back in the 18th century or 19th century, that wherever the German army went, wherever the German navy went, that's where the German missionaries went. Because they followed in the wake of those movements, just like the Spanish priests followed the conquistas.
Right, and that's what I was thinking with the Spanish priests, is like, well, with some exceptions, you pretty much have to become a Spaniard.
Right.
You're not just converting, to faith. We're not going to translate, for example, the scriptures into whatever the native tongues are. We're going to
we'll just teach them Spanish.
We'll teach them Spanish, right? And then or Latin, and then But you also have to become like us culturally, and I think that's That's really where the difficulty comes. And well, yesterday was Pentecost, right? And that you think about how crazy it was to have all those, at that point, nationalities, effectively, right? Yeah. I mean, they weren't all nations; they were city-states and whatnot. But these people gathered, they didn't have a common language, but they were all converts, to Judaism and then to Christianity. But they couldn't stay together.
Exactly.
In Jerusalem.
Yeah.
They had to go back to their homes. They had to go back to their people. But they went with the gospel, which was the beauty of that, right? Yeah. And does that overcome the inequality? No. I mean, the inequality keeps going, and the animosity between the churches, it keeps going.
Well, it goes to this day, even, and to speak anecdotally, again, in my opinion, there's only one color that politicians and the media care about, and that's green. And right now, both, as it comes out almost every day, like Steve Jobs made something like, an extra $80 billion during the shutdown from COVID.
Not Steve Jobs, Tim Cook.
Oh, good. No, not Tim Cook. Steve Bezos.
Bezos, Amazon.
Jeff Bezos. There we go. Jeff Bezos. Jeepers. I'm confusing my billionaires. So it's a class problem as well. And I say in the church because at a certain point in the past, not so long ago, my congregation was designated as a dead church.
Right.
And this was in a file in a drawer that supposedly didn't exist, but we all knew it existed because people had seen it and snapped pictures on their phones.
Right.
And there were dead churches in my district, and there were not dead churches. And it was not shockingly divided by the number of people in the congregation and the amount of money that went to the district.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty broadly speaking. There are large congregations within our church body that are, I hate to say it, but are like nigh on to being heterodox, at least, being that mixture.
Right. But they enjoy a place of privilege.
Because of their financial.
Exactly.
Place. Remember, I think I've told this story, maybe even on this show, in Indiana, the congregation I served, right up the street was this just wild and crazy Roman Catholic parish. And I asked the priest at the more conservative parish who I was friends with, I just said, what's the story with them? Because they were doing things like, they actually did a 50-50 raffle as one of their offerings on Sunday mornings. And I was like, that seems a little strange. I mean, I know your church's position on gambling and whatnot.
Right.
He's like, yeah, except they send a lot of money to the diocese.
Exactly.
And so the archbishop looks the other way. I'm like, oh, I see.
Right.
That's how it works.
Yes. Unfortunately, that is how it works. And
so that's church politics, that's national politics, state politics.
And something that then you and I have been talking about is the lack of intellectual thought influencers in our culture today, both conservative and liberal points of view. But likewise, as I've noted too, in Minneapolis, up until very, very recently, like, the last day or two, there's just been an utter lack of leadership within the protests. And now community organizers are stepping up and taking control of the situation, so to speak, because people listen to them, they trust them, they respect them, and have regard for them. But by and large,
giving them someone to follow rather than it being just kind of more chaotic.
Right, okay. Exactly. And in that sense, then what you see is a divide between community and community organizers and the mayors of Minneapolis and St. Paul and the governor.
Right, because we're not going to follow them because they're partly, at least perceived, responsible.
They are the problem. Well, as an example, and this is a published fact, so this isn't my opinion, but Amy Klobuchar, who some might be familiar with because she was a part of the Democratic
primaries,
thank you, yeah. Mm-hmm. She might actually be picked as Biden's vice president. I know she's being vetted.
It's possible.
But when she was running the show in Minnesota from a legal standpoint, she gave this police officer who's now been arrested for the murder of George Floyd, she didn't prosecute him when he shot somebody else and had over 12 complaints filed against him.
Yeah. No, that's...
and then she gets on TV the other night and, again, is talking about racial injustice and inequality. And the tone deafness of that particular statement, that the community that is protesting is going to listen to her and say, yeah, we have total amnesia about your time in Minnesota and what you did. Like, can't remember that stuff. That just incenses this sense that this isn't a protest now. This is a revolution.
At this point, yeah. What did I say? Oh, it looked like the French Revolution, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
and it has a lot of the same kind of political undertones, right? Just give them bread,
Right. Yeah. Others have said that there's no sports to watch.
Right.
We're not supposed to go out of our houses and go to the lake and go to the parks and go about our lives, which, by the way, notice all of a sudden since last Friday, we're not talking about small business owners declaring bankruptcy and starving. Like, that's gone again.
Well, and I think, what does that illustrate? Well, it does show the high degree of manipulation of the situation that's coming, from, the way that the media has shifted.
Right.
You and I, we were probably right at the tail end of the so-called, what I would call more objective, evening news,
Mm-hmm,
right. Where, who was the guy, the CBS evening one, where he would just end, and that's
Walter Cronkite.
That's the way it is. That's how he end the broadcast. Yeah. Well, and that's what it is.
Yeah.
And you cannot, no, I don't think anybody has that degree of trust in their media.
They're all activists.
To some degree or another, yeah.
Unapologetically so. It's just opinion after opinion after opinion, presented as fact without any primary documents or evidence whatsoever.
Well, and the best ones, I don't know about you, but I find the ones that are the most helpful are the ones that embrace it as being entertainment.
Right.
And so they're like comedians, basically. So they take the news story and they just basically laugh at everything. Right. And it seems like you almost get closer to the truth that way.
Well, I was listening to someone talk about that a couple of weeks ago, that when Jon Stewart was on The Daily Show, like him or not, at that time in the run-up to the first Obama inauguration, most college students, again, for better or worse, but most college students got their news from The Daily Show. Because Jon Stewart was a thought leader.
Which was skit comedy almost.
Essentially, yeah. It was a satire of the news. But yet they were telling you the news and then satirizing the news. Whereas the corporate media, were simply presenting as fact their opinions, their political biases.
Yeah, and Jon Stewart's a serious man. He can be.
He is. Obviously, he's a liberal.
Right.
But at the same time, he attacked the Democrats for the absurdities of their platform or their statements and their behavior, as well as Republicans and conservatives. And he was a thought leader. It was cool to be liberal at that point because the thought leaders that were the cool thought leaders were liberals. Whereas today, the quote unquote cool thought leaders, the people who meme the funny memes, are conservatives. But they're not conservatives in the way that you and I grew up learning what a conservative was. Because you have a guy like Dave Rubin, for example, who's now a conservative, but he's a gay man who's married.
Right.
And you have people that are for the legalization of drugs recreationally, like all drugs, but they're conservative. And it's strange then to see that. I think what's happened is that, you have the polarization of these two ideologies, and it's kind of pulling people one way or the other like magnets. And then for someone like myself who tries to stay in the middle and just be thoughtful and think for myself, I'm constantly being shouted at from either ditch and hearing, well, you have to join us or you have to join them because you can't be one or the other.
Obviously, virtue signaling is part of this, right?
Right.
which is unfortunate with social media. That's really amplified that.
Yeah, it's crazy right now.
Trying to prove your loyalty, to either party or to ideology.
Right.
Like in this case, I mean, you and I both, we saw the video, George Floyd, and what happened there. It's terrible, whether he was on drugs or not. And
it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. That's not how you handle, somebody.
Likewise, baptized Christian.
Yeah, I sent you that story from Christianity Today. Talks about
that was in my sermon yesterday. I included that.
Talks about his work,
and in 2 articles that eventually I hope get published.
But the problem is that, like, for us to be very public about that then is going to be perceived as like some kind of political agenda.
Sure. Or
we're trying to indicate, that we are not a right-wing Christian, we're a left-wing Christian, or whatever it is.
Right.
And those labels, I think we've talked a lot about polarization and black and white and a binary kind of approach to things being uncritical and also unthinking.
Right.
And in this situation, is to look at it and say the horrible racial injustice. Situation is terribly complicated. It's an election.
Murder is murder.
But murder is murder. But then justice can't be served. I mean, you can't be a vigilante about this. It's like rioters aren't going to get instantaneous justice.
No. Well, but the point is that you then have to ask the question, well, what is justice?
Yeah.
Who's defining it? And we definitely have a multitude then of definitions running around right now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not simple.
Because some police officers or law enforcement were shot and killed in Oakland over the weekend.
I saw that. Federal officer. Yeah.
Chicago cops were dragged down the street and attacked and beaten. And, I have a friend in the suburbs of Chicago, and he's locked and loaded with his wife because a couple doors down, that's how far they made it. And they were attacking people in the suburbs. Santa Monica was on fire yesterday. Beverly Hills was getting lit up and tagged.
Of all places.
Of all places, exactly. But the point is then that of all places means these are wealthy areas. This doesn't happen here.
Mm-mm.
And like I noted to my wife this morning, a lot of people I know who are anti-Second Amendment up until last week are all of a sudden very Second Amendment because now this affects them.
Well, what do you have when you have a law enforcement that can't enforce the law anymore?
Right.
What it begs the question, what's the value of them?
Well, my friend's neighbor called the police in Chicago and was told, and I quote, "Do what you have to do to take care of yourself because we can't get there." Like you call the police for help and that's what you're told. Like in Minneapolis, 911 doesn't even answer. They didn't, that was like shut off or something. Like they were so overloaded.
That was a remarkable thing with the COVID response, just to draw a parallel to that.
Yeah.
Is that it opened people's eyes to recognize that our hospital capacity is, we can serve at any given point in time. What is it? Like 1% of our population at the most?
Right.
It's not even that. I mean, we don't have the capacity for a large scale illness.
Yeah, it's like we got to the top of the vert ramp and then discovered that our board was cracked. And we're like, nah, we could probably make it. We could probably pull this trick off with a cracked board. We can land this one. And then it just snaps.
There are a few people that will understand that reference.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
But it's the same thing here. I mean, a police force, it's not, they can't rule a situation like this. They're not equipped for that. They're generally, what do they plan for? Maybe a crime incident rate of less. Again, it's going to be less than 1% of the population involved in criminal activity.
I was talking with a member of my congregation yesterday. He was a not parole officer, a prison guard.
Okay.
And I was saying, I liken this to that you talk to somebody who works in a prison and the number of inmates to guards is overwhelmingly in favor of the inmates should they decide to riot.
Yeah.
So talking with my member, we were talking about this, there's an ethic there that we're going to be cool with you as long as you're cool with us. As long as you respect us and don't treat us like animals or slaves.
Right.
And abuse us, we're going to be cool with you. And if you say, hey, go here, do this, do that, we're cool with that. But as soon as we feel like you're dehumanizing us, we're going to push back. And remember, there's 100 of us for every one of you. Now, the reason though...
There's like an equilibrium or something, right?
There is. There's a balance there. And you're always on the razor's edge, he pointed out, which is why it's so difficult to not become almost criminal in your thinking as a prison guard at a certain point.
Well, prison guards, there's plenty of documentation to show...
Yeah, I know. Yeah, but the point is that, the threat of overwhelming force coming in from the outside of the prison is the thing that kind of maintains that balance in the end.
Oh, so they could bring in additional forces.
Right, they'll bring in a riot squad, they'll bring in a quick
Okay.
response force to lock it down. So in the end, you can riot and you might beat up or kill the guards in that prison block, but the prison block will be locked down. And then we're going to bring in tear gas, and we're going to bring in rubber bullets, and we're going to bring in the riot squad and the quick reaction force.
And the long term is going to be worse than the short term.
Exactly, right. Yeah. And you see that then, like in Minneapolis, is that they were overwhelmed for about 48, 72 hours, give or take. Then the National Guard came in, and then the general took over and said, no, I'll take it from here.
Right.
And that stuff got shut down within 24 hours. Like immediately things changed.
Well, and I think that's the nature of social media and viral, posting is that the law enforcement, National Guard, those kind of things aren't built for that kind of instantaneous response.
Right. No, 100%. Because there's that balance. And when that balance swings one way or the other, even like a step, like I said, it's a very fragile relationship, really.
Yeah, yeah.
And if that tips one way or the other, it just flips over. And once it flips, you can't write that again. It's going to be a decade, as you and I know. It's going to be a decade of daily work. Like it has to be daily that the community organizes. The community sets up its own accountability panel to hold the police force accountable. And this is another complaint that's happening right now by community organizers is the mayor and the governor are proposing another committee to oversee the police, but they're the ones who are going to organize it. They're the ones who are going to decide who gets to be on and who doesn't get to be on. And they're saying, we've done this before. This is the same old song and dance. We will organize it. We will put the people that we want on there, and we will oversee the police. And of course, they're like, no, we gotta quote unquote compromise. It's like in Deadpool 2. Let's agree to disagree. I'm right.
Yeah, or I was thinking about, Treaty of Versailles?
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, we're not going to ask the Germans their opinion on this.
Right,
We're just going to tell them what is. Right. You can see what that got them, right? I mean, over the long term, there was no... I mean, you're not absolving people. You're not forgiving them, of blame, but you do want them to have... What do we have? What do we call this? Like where they have the opportunity to defend themselves.
Due process.
Right? Due process, that's it, right? Where, I mean, I know that... We watched this video with the cops, and we don't know what led to it. We know some of it. We know, the particular guys involved, and maybe some of the things going on with them. But then when it comes to systematic, I mean, they need to be able to express that. Look, we're understaffed. We're ill-equipped for this. We don't have training for this kind of situation. Whatever. Right. We weren't ready to respond here, and we're not saying that their actions, were just or right, or that we're just going to look the other way. On the other hand, recognize, there's a lot of sin to go around, right? We're going to sin against one another.
Well, that's right, is that there's always going to be a perpetrator. There's always going to be a victim. But at a certain point...
They flip.
They flip, exactly. Or it just becomes so muddy, especially when it comes to original sin.
Yeah.
And I talk about the Imprecatory Psalms a lot right now because we're doing that in the Christ Hold Fast live stream on Wednesday mornings. David isn't saying I'm not a sinner, but what he is saying in the Imprecatory Psalms is this ain't my sin. Like I'm not perpetrating the sin. I'm the victim. And if we interpret original sin monolithically,
like you're entirely at fault or somebody else is entirely at fault.
Well, it's that equivocation that I hear so often of, well, we can't judge other sinners because I'm a sinner too. Well, no. Wait, stop. That's not the way that David teaches us.
You do judge your sin.
You do judge yourself as a sinner in a Psalm 51 sense. But in a Psalm, let's say 8 sense, I'm not the enemy here. I'm not the one who's perpetrating the violence against the nation. I'm not the one who's come into the city and burned it down. I'm the one who's been called to defend the city.
Like, and like the church wouldn't, this is sarcasm, like we wouldn't pray against the enemies of the faith.
Right.
Because, they're sinners too. Like,
Well, that's a whole side issue, as I've brought up several times, is we don't really pray the Imprecatory Psalms liturgically anymore, which I think also goes to the point of what has happened to the church and the soft piety or the weak piety that I was
going to say, we don't have real enemies anymore.
No, because we're weak and cowardly by and large.
We won't name them.
We won't name them, exactly. We don't want to offend.
And there might be half a world away now.
Yeah, but there's those within our own communities that we don't pray against either.
Yeah, that's true.
The enemies of the gospel in our own communities in regards to addiction, domestic violence, those who are outwardly attacking the gospel and the ministry of the church by lying and gossiping about the minister or the people in the church, that we don't pray against our enemies that God would convert them.
Well, because they might be our friends.
Right, and God forbid that they don't come to church with us because we prayed against them. When that's kind of the point, is by praying against them, you are praying for them.
Yeah, because you're giving them over to God.
Right. And even your enemies. This is Psalm 9. I switched the Psalm yesterday to Psalm 9 because it fits more with Genesis and John in regards to Pentecost. David just straight up is like, yeah, you need to tear these people down, destroy them, destroy their nation.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're going to be destroyed and there won't be anybody to praise you.
Yeah, I talked about, I preached on Babel and it was the same story. It's like, wow, God's pretty terrible here.
Right.
Yeah, well, the people are pretty terrible too.
Right. It's a first commandment matter.
Mm-hmm.
There's only one God, and the only unforgivable sin is to reject what the Spirit is trying to do for you.
Make a name for yourself.
Right. Yeah. And so I think the lack of thought leaders in the present tense on both sides, and then when we do have thought leaders step up and speak, we ignore them or vilify them immediately because they don't play for our team. Whether you like Jordan Peterson or not, as an example, he evokes strong emotions in people.
He does.
People that I meet that know of Jordan Peterson are either, I hate him, he's evil, or I love him, he changed my life. I don't find a lot of people who are meh about Jordan Peterson. That being said, he is an intellectual. He's a public intellectual selling out theaters up until he got sick here recently.
And now he can't tour anyway.
No, he can't tour anyways. But the point is that we don't, like the Weinstein brothers, you have a guy like Ben Shapiro, the intellectual dark web, as they were labeled by, I think, New Yorker magazine or something.
Mm-hmm, right.
But the point is that there's a small enough group of them that they can actually be like named and grouped together in this. And what's really interesting then is you have Joe Rogan, who is
named, yeah,
very pro legalization of not only marijuana but DMT and mushrooms and other things. Then you have Ben Shapiro, an Orthodox Jew, on the other side,
right?
Who Joe and Ben consider each other basically friends. And then you have Jordan Peterson in there, and you have the Weinsteins. And so you have these people of different ideologies, and yet the reason that they are classified together is because they want to have a critical conversation. And despite their differences, they are open to a dialogue with people they disagree with for the betterment of everyone. And they're vilified.
We don't have that in our political class.
We don't. So Joe Rogan, as an example, then, because he's so popular, very pro legalization of certain drugs, also super pro Second Amendment because he's a hunter. Commentates for the UFC. He's a martial artist himself, which, but then on the flip side, he's, what is the polar opposite of the UFC?
I don't know. Going to a
ideologically,
Mennonite farm.
I don't know, whatever. But that's what I'm saying is that you have people like that who can say, well, I am pro gay marriage, but I'm also super pro Second Amendment.
Oh, synchronized swimming would be the opposite.
Yeah, so he's very anti-synchronized swimming, very pro punch people in the face, right? But then you have other people that in that very small group, and the point then is that even within the church, as you and I have experienced, I'm sure many of listeners have, there's not a lot of space within the church for a more nuanced conversation because people have chosen their sides, and we've become very tribal in the past couple of years. And we've experienced this on this show. We get emails. If we mention Trump or we mention a Democratic or a liberal politician, we're immediately attacked for either being pro-liberal politician, anti-Trump, or pro-Trump, anti-liberal politician versus people can be right every once in a while.
Yeah, even a blind squirrel, right?
Right. We can agree with and disagree with a person based on that particular example, or we're just using it as an example. Theologically, kind of the same thing.
I was thinking a little bit, though, and we talked about, before we went on the air, part of the problem with the nuanced thinking is that we're not nuanced holistically, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah.
And that, like, I mean, even as this conversation has gone, and I don't know if anybody's actually going to enjoy listening to this, but we'll find out.
Hopefully not.
It's not just because we're pastors, but, we're Christians. We consider ourselves, I guess, more intellectual minded, or at least critical thinking.
Right.
Whether we have the tools to do it well or not is, remains to be seen, I suppose. But
always learning.
You probably think more highly. Yeah, exactly.
Shoshin.
We're interested in self-improvement in a philosophical sense, right?
Yeah.
And being, critical of ourselves.
Right.
And we try to approach ourselves holistically, and then those who have been put into our care, like as a congregation or families, holistically, and say, it's not just about getting, like, say, getting education right, or just getting the economics right, or getting the faith right. Is that we're whole people, right? And that's what I don't see. Is I see, like, well, you can be critical about I don't know, space exploration,
right? There you go.
But you can't be critical about your religious or political affiliation, because, like, if you're going to be a part of this group or tribe, those things have to be agreed upon, and maybe
they have to be rigid,
and they have to be rigidly agreed upon. Right? There's no flexibility here, and which also then leaves no room for growth.
Well, and that's the thing, and it's a great point, is that we see this in even politics, then, that there are certain ideological groups within politics who are pretty much jihadists when it comes to the way in which they espouse their doctrine.
Yeah, we'll kill the other party, literally.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. Like, they become...
We're going to destroy them.
Yeah. That they share more in common with jihadis than they do with the founders of that particular movement or group. And this is something that's come up very recently, obviously, with the riots or protests, depending on what city you live in and how you look at it, is that I see a lot of people quoting Martin Luther King Jr.
we were going to read it.
Yeah, well, we still can, but I said half jokingly, whenever black people bust out, white people always start quoting Martin Luther King. What they don't do is quote Malcolm X or Huey Newton or Medgar, others like of that
I have no
ideology.
Idea.
Right. And
I mean, that's not part of my education.
Right. And that's the stuff that I was reading in college, along with the Tao Te Ching and the Bhagavad Gita and things like that. Because I just wanted to know, because I hadn't been exposed to that growing up in northern Minnesota. I had not been exposed to the Black Panther movement or the civil rights movement and all of the different, strains. And
I wouldn't even know where to go, because like we were talking about, there's always agendas in the way that even the histories are told.
Right, absolutely. That's why I read biographies.
Well,
if there's going to be an agenda, I want it to be the person's agenda who's writing. It's like The Last Dance.
Oh, autobiography.
Autobiography, thank you.
Yeah,
not biography. Yeah. Autobiography. It's like there's a documentary on ESPN called The Last Dance about the Bulls, Chicago Bulls.
Yeah, and you think Michael Jordan had something to do with how it was presented?
Well, that's Michael Jordan's documentary, for sure.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Many people have pointed out, this is not a documentary about the Bulls. This is a documentary about Michael Jordan by Michael Jordan, because he had absolute creative control over the shape.
Didn't he finance it too?
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
Okay.
Because it was a part of the original contract when they signed the deal to let these camera crews follow them around in the mid-90s, that he had final say when the film was released, how it was released, everything. That's why some people have speculated the reason it came out right now is because the hype around LeBron has grown to such a pitch, and people are starting to forget that Mike is the greatest. And so Mike just wanted everybody to remember.
Little marketing.
I am the greatest. Don't forget it.
Buy my shoes.
And I completely agree. Michael Jordan's the greatest basketball player to ever play the game, period, hands down.
I'm not saying he's the greatest person that ever lived.
No.
Regardless of what the documentary
But that's the whole, but he talks about that in the documentary. He talks about, he addresses that. He actually starts crying when he's talking about it, because a lot of people weren't down with how he conducted himself and the way in which he expressed himself and his desire to win and to elevate everyone around him.
I mean, how many games did he play? 120, 130 games this season?
Yeah, something like that.
I mean, you can't be on the road that much and have like a decent relationship to anybody.
Not if you want to be the best, and that's all that matters.
No, because you're out, you're practicing all day. Yeah.
Anybody who that's their point, is to be the best, whether it's Lance Armstrong, Michael Jordan, or others. Again, in politics, same way. In the church, same way. There is this certain kind of person who is so driven to be the best that they will stop at nothing, and there's nothing that they won't sacrifice to get there,
including their own humanity.
And so to walk it back then, or circle back around, when I discovered like MLK Jr., for example, it was I'd read him before my conversion, but then having lived in the South and having been exposed to black churches in the rural South where I lived at in Louisiana, and having been an atheist at the time, it was really impressive to me the difference between what church was like growing up in Minnesota and then going to rural Louisiana and hearing black churches on Sunday mornings where I was 2 miles away and I could hear them. And that impressed me even at that time. So after my conversion, I went back and I again, just out of curiosity, I studied the history of the Black church in the South and Christianity in the South, and then butted up against Martin Luther King, and then from him discovered Malcolm X and read Malcolm X, and then out of that read people like Huey Newton and others in the Black Panther movement, and on and on and on. Not that I agreed with them or disagree with them. I just wanted to know,
right?
What were you about? What did you stand for? Why did you do this? Why did you say that? And is other people's portrayal of you, my teachers in college, the media, movies, whatever, is their portrayal honest? Or, as you pointed out, is there an agenda? Is there a message that they're trying to sell me on?
No, there always is. There always is.
Of course there is. Of course there is. But that's the point.
Because there's something that motivates them, and if they don't believe it, then they're a psychopath.
But I think that's the point of maturation, at least in my opinion. I'm at the point now where I don't believe you're an adult until you can separate your opinion from your identity. Mm-hmm. Because so many people will say something and then I'll disagree with it, and then they think I'm attacking them personally, which is the same thing that my 8-year-old does when I say, well, that was a dumb thing to do.
Yeah.
They hear you're dumb. So very early on in my parenting career, I had to walk those things back and go, oh yeah, no, I can't just say something uncritically and expect my 8-year-old to differentiate between what he did and himself as a person. But he's 8. But when you're 48, hopefully, but that's not always the case. It's usually not the case. And then secondly, the older I get, the more I am aware of how much I don't know. And how fragile and tenuous life is.
Yeah.
And what a privilege it is to just be alive at all, especially in my case. And so when something like this pops off, one, I've been around long enough to have seen it before.
Right.
So it's not new. Which is why when
we remember 1992.
That too. So when friends are like, dude, how are you always right? I'm like, it's not because I'm Nostradamus. It's just because I've lived long enough to be able to recognize, okay, this is happening now, which means that the next thing, it's almost like that you get a playbook when you get elected to office. Here's the playbook for how you handle this.
Well, history's cyclical.
It is, unfortunately. And then secondly,
because we have short-term memory, I suppose.
We just don't have thought leaders like them anymore. Because not only were they educated, but they were wise in the ways of the world. Not only were they wise, but they were articulate and could express themselves well. They were masters of optics, and they were the expert salesmen. They understood the power of the media and how to exploit it for their own purposes.
Fireside chats, that kind of thing. Yeah.
But they were inspiring as well. They were charismatic leaders. And we've talked about this on the podcast. There's 3 types of leaders that kind of drive movements: charismatic, apocalyptic, and moral. And these were charismatic leaders. That's why after they died, the movement kind of imploded.
Yeah.
And the people that were around them were great men in their own right or not, but they didn't have that thing that elevated them above everyone else, like the Michael Jordans and Lance Armstrongs in that conversation. So I see a lot of people quoting MLK, don't see a lot of people quoting Malcolm X, which is because they don't read all of Malcolm X or understand the arc of his life. Or why he was shot in the end, which may surprise a lot of people. Why?
That there's epochs within, his thinking. He's not this is what I was going to suggest. And I think, for you and I mean, the people we respect the most are the ones that kind of defy definition.
Yeah.
Who aren't easily painted into a corner to say, because they don't fit an ideology, or not even that. They don't fit a mold or a stereotype.
Well, they reject it.
Well, and because they recognize humanity is diverse and creative.
Right.
Right. And so you say, well, I think about, I don't know, like a composer, and they say, well, you're a romantic composer. And I think most of them would say that's offensive to them.
Right.
They'd say, I'm not. I have all these influences, and I don't meet that definition that you're talking about. I don't fit within that box.
How does the saying go? When you define me, you limit me.
Yeah. Maybe that's the problem. Because some people want to be defined and limited because there's a comfort in that, saying because there's no requirement for growth or change,
right?
There's no forces, because you've set up the perimeter, you've set saying here's who I am, but then also you're not equipped to adapt to a situation and to say the things that I've been saying or the ideas that I hold to, are they still appropriate for this situation?
Right.
What we're facing today. can I hold to the same ideology that I did 20 years ago when the enemy shifts, or the crisis is radically different.
Right. Well, I think that's the point, is where you and I are at least, when we look at this and we try and detach and observe rather than just kind of project our presuppositions onto the situation.
Mm-hmm.
At least listen, actively listen, and then come back into our congregations. Because I think, in my opinion, as a pastor, I have a responsibility, and I had a conversation with a woman after church yesterday about this, because she thanked me for addressing George Floyd and addressing this whole matter of justice and love, and how do we define that in relation to Christ, for example.
Right.
And again, hopefully I've got some articles coming out this week on this matter. But
and to point out, in your case, it is the front burner, for your community, because it's right at your back. Yeah. It's at your back door.
Right.
Right. Whereas my community, we're still distanced from it, and people aren't thinking that much. They're still thinking COVID. So
right. No, I have personal friends with their guns locked and loaded, standing on their porch.
Right.
And they got their bag, and it's either I'm going to get to Riley's house, or I'm going to have to shoot my way out of this to protect my community, my neighborhood. It's real. It's legit. And I have friends all over the country that have texted me, and that's the same situation they're in. And so it's very real for me. But then on top of that, as a Christian,
mm-hmm.
and this is the difficulty, and I was talking with my friend Brittany about this, because just for point of context, she's a Black Christian woman who I train with. And she has friends calling her an Uncle Tom, because as a Christian, she's preaching love and true justice in the Christian sense, and go to the cross of Christ. That's where you'll find justice. That's where you'll find true godly justice and love. And we need to work from that. That's our identity as Christians. So some friends are calling her an Uncle Tom for saying that. But then on the flip side, she has other people attacking her for not being Black enough. I'm sorry, that's the same side. So I should say she's being attacked for not being Black enough because of her Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
But then she's being attacked by Christians for standing up for this injustice that's been done to George Floyd and the Black community in Minneapolis for so long. So she's getting attacked from both sides, where one side's saying, you're Black, why aren't you on our side? And the other side saying, you're Christian, why aren't you on our side? Mm-hmm. And she's like, and to the point then is, Christianity isn't what you do, it's who you are. It's your identity as a baptized child of God. My children are my children, not because of what they do, but by the very fact that they're flesh of my flesh. And therefore, in the church, I try and always maintain that tension, to live in that tension of, we are Christians. That is our identity. You don't have to work at it. It's simply who you are. Now, that being said, there is great freedom within that to then go out and live in relation to your neighbor in charity and kindness and long-suffering, to bend down, to lift them up, to stand shoulder to shoulder with them, to attempt to elevate the whole community, the whole neighborhood, and to say, in an earthly sense, there is justice that needs to be done.
Right.
The law is the law, and murder is murder. And that should be equitable. But yet, then in the theological side of the house, God is equitable. He judges with equity. And therefore, all people are judged by God equitably at the cross of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
No one is beyond redemption. No one is beyond forgiveness, even those that we hate, which is why Jesus commands us, does not invite us, he commands us to love our enemies. Because God's kind of smart that way.
Yeah. But the most lovely thing might be to leave your home and get out of town.
Right.
Not just for your sake,
yeah.
But don't give your neighbor opportunity to sin either.
Right, that too. And that's my point, and you nailed it, is that there are going to be times when, unfortunately, you're going to have to kill for your neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually proven by the Bible. There are plenty of saints in the Bible who had to kill to protect their neighbor from the enemy. There are others who fled.
Physical, spiritual, all sorts of enemies.
Absolutely. In fact, there's a letter that we're reading right now in Bible study. We just started this past Wednesday. It's Luther's letter to John Hess about whether Christians can flee the plague or not. And the beauty of Luther's response is, one, why are you asking me to respond? You're an adult. Think for yourselves. He basically opens the letter saying that. But since you won't leave me alone, he says, and you've written so many letters, here's my opinion, he says. My opinion. If your conscience says stay, stay. if your conscience says flee, only flee if there is someone else that can serve in your vocation for you.
Okay.
But that it's a matter of Christian freedom whether you stay or whether you flee.
Well, and like I said, it's nuanced, it's complicated.
Right.
I mean, does your neighbor...
It's an 8-page letter. It is very nuanced because you're right.
Right. Well, but think about it. I mean, you have your life or your neighbor's life, but you have property and possessions, right? And you don't... It's not a good thing to have those things destroyed. Right. You also have justice. You don't want to give people opportunity to sin and to rebel against God-given authority. Although they have the right to protest that authority when it's not done in accordance with natural law, with God's law.
To the point then, let me read you the explanation of the fifth commandment in our Lutheran Small Catechism. You shall not murder. What does this mean? We should fear and love God so that we do not hurt or harm our neighbor in his body, but help and support him in every physical need.
Right.
Now, when things are leisurely and comfortable and safe, that seems like I just got to be nice to my neighbor, take care of my neighbor, right? Help my neighbor out. But right now, that may mean that I got to stand in front of a store with a gun,
right,
so that these people don't burn down my neighbor's store and he can't feed his family. Or, by the way, feed me anymore because that store was where I shopped at. And this is something that I've talked about in relation to the priesthood and chaplaincy, for example, that up until the Geneva Convention, priests fought alongside the soldiers in the military. It's pretty common. And then after the Geneva Convention, they're like, nah, you need to be in the back. We'll call you when things are okay.
Almost as if warfare is not atheological, but the theology is in the background.
They certainly seem to want to make it that way, don't they? And likewise then, natural law is natural law. And virtue ethics are virtue ethics, and I think everyone should be well-versed in both. Because again, on the philosophical side of the house, in the first article, in creation sense and a neighborly sense, you should understand what virtue ethics are and how they are manifest in our lives, and understand natural law so that you understand, hey, you know what? The Bible says this, but I'm feeling this way, or I'm thinking this way. Or, I'm more than willing to die to protect my family, but I don't understand what you mean by killing to protect my family is an expression of loving my neighbor as myself. Like, I don't understand that. It says turn the other cheek here, but then over here, I'm called to wage war against the Babylonians or something.
Right.
Like, how can the Bible say what seem to be contradictory things? Or Paul says in Romans that the government was given the sword in order to punish evil, but then what happens when the government is evil?
Well, like you said, identity is part of the problem here, and I think we think of it as a static thing. Like,
yes.
Like law enforcement's always law enforcement. I'm civilian, always civilian. And like, not when there's somebody coming to kill you.
Right.
Now you're called actually to enforce the law.
Right. To help and support your neighbor.
As a father or husband or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and then you may not be in that vocation forever. You may, again, leave, that necessity may step backward. I don't know if it always does. I mean, husband and father, that's a protecting office. So
right, but if your family is taken from you by the plague or by a tragic accident or something of that nature, you're not in the office anymore now.
No.
And I think, like I said at the beginning of this, a lot of people have been unmasked. Maybe we all have in a certain sense, because my church, for example, because of COVID-19 and the fear-mongering that's been happening, they're just afraid to come back. In fact, I had a great conversation with a woman from my congregation yesterday. And she said the reason that she hadn't come to church wasn't because she didn't want to or that she was afraid of getting sick. She was actually afraid that her kids were going to infect people at church.
Right.
And this is a nurse talking. And I said, she's tortured. She's tortured in her conscience because she desperately wants to come back to the Lord's table. And she wants to just come into, like my organist said, I know this building isn't the Big C church, pastor, but just coming here on Sundays makes me feel right again.
Well, it's her church.
Right. That's what I said. I'm like, but this building is a part of you.
This is the place been given to you. Yeah,
right. Exactly.
For that reason. And
so on the one hand, as friends have said to me, well, I don't understand why people are so mad about churches being closed. You can worship God anywhere. I'm like, you're right. You can. But that's why we as a church need to ask why we're gathering together in this place on this day at this time.
Specific people around a specific altar. Yeah.
Exactly. What my friends who are not Christians are missing from the cultural Christian caricature that or stereotypes that they latch onto is the bodiliness, the incarnation of the church, but also then the gifts.
Right. And that God sets people in order in families, in congregations, in communities. Don't abandon. It's not just your congregation, but your family, but also your community. These are your people, whether you like it or not.
And this is something like yesterday, for example, was Sunday. What was great was getting home and seeing so many Christian ministers in particular marching in the protests, but what they were doing is calling people to kneel in prayer. Because one of the things that the protesters are doing is kneeling to protest police corruption and police violence. And
in some places,
like in Minneapolis. And so these preachers are showing up and saying, hey, you know what? Since we're taking a knee, let's pray to the God of justice. Let's pray to the God of love. Let's pray in the name of Jesus Christ, our Savior, that he would bring justice for this community, to these people, for the murder of George Floyd, and bring justice and peace to his family. But let's remember that ultimately justice and peace come from one person, and that's God, our Heavenly Father. And so...
And all will behold him on the last day.
Exactly. So let's march. Let's protest. Let's exercise our constitutional right. But let's also remember in the midst of this that prayer does actually do something. And that ultimately then there's a higher justice and a deeper love at work here than what you are willing to see or acknowledge. And I think in churches on Sunday, in my opinion, this is what's been missing, is that we've been great at abstracting and spiritualizing, small s, spiritualizing the faith and Jesus and God. But then you read the Psalms, like Psalm 9 yesterday, and David isn't talking in the abstract about seeing the wonders of God. He's naming them. But what he's naming then in the rest of the Psalm is how God crushes his enemies and destroys their cities and wipes their nation off the face of history. Their names will not be remembered in the book of life.
Right.
So David is saying, here is the wonder of God. Here's what causes me to go, wow. God addressed my enemies for me and utterly wiped them off the face of the earth for me. That is the most concrete, real.
I mean, it's hard to call that a good thing.
In earthly terms.
In
just purely earthly terms, in measure, But yet, if I were living in Jerusalem under King David and they were at the gates, the enemy was at the gates, would I consider that a good thing? 100%.
Yeah, God preserved my life.
Absolutely, of course I would.
My family, my community, all preserved by God.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. In the abstract, we can sit comfortably and spiritualize it and say, well, is it a good thing or not? But when you're on the inside and on the outside, they're trying to breach the gates.
Right.
Now, all of a sudden, you are being called up to hold the sword, and you're not going to say, well, I'm a conscientious objector. I don't believe in violence. And there are those, for sure. There are absolutely those people, but they're the exclusion of the norm.
Yeah.
And again, I honor their strength of character and the courage to say, I refuse to carry a gun or I refuse to wield the sword because my conscience is, again, I eat vegetables. I don't eat meat, like Paul talks about in Romans.
Right.
But nonetheless, God, like you said, appoints us to a vocation. And within that vocation, we are going to be called at various times and places to do something that is not within what we imagined were the parameters of that vocation.
Or even in our character or ability.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That I think you and I normally are peaceful people. You are, for sure.
Definitely, yeah.
I've been bare knuckle sparring for the last 2 months, so I'm not quite sure how
you
that
take it out on other people in a fun
but
way.
only people I like.
And who are willing to receive it.
Exactly, and dish it. But the point then is that that's the vocation I've been called to. And I don't walk around looking for a fight then as a consequence.
No.
Because I understand the consequences of violence and the consequences of starting a fight with somebody. And my training partner in Muay Thai, he outweighs me by 70 pounds. So I'm very aware of the consequences of violence against a larger person. But the point is then that within our vocations, I didn't know 4 years ago that I'd be having this conversation with you today on this podcast even.
No, nobody did.
Nobody did. I didn't know 4 years ago I would be training in secret in a garage and Fight Club would be a documentary. Like, look around. My city is burning.
Yeah.
And people having to meet in private, in secret, because our governor is forbidden small businesses from opening. So I am exercising my right as a free man in society to disobey and to say, Executive orders don't supersede the Constitution. That being said, I also recognize that there are these people out on the roads who also have the freedom to arrest and fine me $1,000 for doing this.
True.
And some would say, you're wrong, especially as a Christian. You're wrong. You're setting a bad example. That's not love. Others would say, no, you're right. Even as a Christian, you're still right within your vocation. And again, I'm not going to argue either side is right or wrong. I'm going to simply say, yeah, I'm a sinner. I sin. That's what I do. I make choices. And my philosophy is better a good choice right now than a great choice too late. That when my neighbor needs me.
Better to do something good than nothing at all.
Exactly. To sit by and say, I'm with you, brother. And then my coach declares bankruptcy and can't pay his mortgage and has to go find a job to feed his family when I could have done something. And I think for too long in the church, for example, in my opinion, for too long we have been allowed the leisure, the luxury to sit on our hands, spiritualize the faith, talk about good works, argue about good works, argue about virtue ethics, argue about natural law. And right now, we have the opportunity to actually act.
Right. But also, I mean, the flip side of that is to play victim, right? So that
100%, absolutely.
So then not only do we talk, the irony of this is to talk about good works and virtue,
right?
But then fail to take action for the very thing that we've been entrusted with, right? You think about like the wise steward or the unwise steward, right? It's like you had the money. Why didn't you just use it? Why are you sitting on it? That's idiotic.
Right.
You know? Right. It's like you've been given a gift, use it.
How easy is it to love your neighbor on social media? Pretty easy, actually.
Yeah.
It's pretty easy.
Yeah.
Because you can just sign out.
Right.
How hard is it? How difficult is it to love your neighbor in concrete reality? If you were locked in an elevator, trapped between floors with your enemy, what would that conversation sound like?
John Wick 3?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's my point too of if we're going to talk about a higher justice and a deeper love in a Christ sense, that God literally nailed the truth about justice and love to the cross for the entire world to behold. He was lifted up so that all men might be drawn to him. And we sit on our hands and spiritualize and abstract and generalize.
That allows us to live just unto ourselves. I think that's the reason for that.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. It
disconnects us from the reality of who's with us.
We just sit around and stare at our own belly buttons and congratulate each other for our piety and how Christian we are. And then when COVID-19 comes around, people just, that's the excuse some people needed to not come back to church anymore. Fear grows like weeds in their mind and chokes out all their other thoughts, so they can't think critically or question anything anymore. So they just hide. I was told again yesterday, I'm not coming back to church until there's a cure. Okay, I guess I'll never see you again.
Yeah, I was going to say that's the resurrection on the last day.
Right. But that's what she's been told, so that's what she repeats, and now it's in her mind, and that's the line. And it's monolithic, it's deterministic, and that's the way it is. I've had other people say,
well, if you don't preach to reality that surrounds you, somebody else will.
100%. And I think that's the point. Exactly. That we as Christian preachers are facing a tidal wave of counter opinions and counter assertions and counter,
not necessarily couched in like religious language, but having that kind of, the same kind of agenda.
The connotation is religious. Like we said, if you want to take, let's say, the far left ideological position, which is very fundamentalist it's very religious fundamentalist in the way it's expressed, then if you hear that and you're sympathetic to it and you agree with it, and then you hear my theological statement on this or this teaching on this, there's now all of a sudden there's these two polarities that are competing for your allegiance. Versus, no, you have to determine this is a matter of salvation. This is a matter of neighborliness.
Right.
Or not. And one informs the other.
Or this is just one opinion.
Or it's an opinion, exactly.
We're not necessarily always talking about truth, right?
Right, which is why, finding your truth is so popular. It gets us off the hook for having to have a conversation about objective reality. But that's the problem then, is that we have so many competing ideas, so many competing perspectives, so many competing assertions flowing around that are we as preachers stepping up and preaching concrete, real, the concrete, real presence of Christ amongst his people, and then the concrete, real presence of us amongst our own people?
Right.
Or are we spiritualizing this to the extent that when people are not at church, they say, yeah, I don't really feel like I'm missing anything. I'm not missing the bodiliness of the church. I'm not missing the water, the bread and wine. I'm not missing the preacher. I'm not missing singing the hymns and praying with my brother and sister Christians. I'm not missing any of that because I can worship God anywhere. Or I can go online and worship God with other people around the world.
Well, that might be partly a consequence. Our congregations are similar in this regard, that they're rural, but the people that attend don't live immediately nearby.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're not a community church.
So it's not a community church. Yeah, we have a parish of a sort, but but yeah, the neighbors to the church aren't the neighbors they're not in the church.
Right.
But the church hasn't reached them either.
The building itself is semi-rural, but the people that are members of my congregation, a vast majority, like 99%, are from cities.
Right.
Around me, exactly. And some do live in the Twin Cities, in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area and other larger cities around us. So they commute into the church. They're not a part of the community. So that creates a different dynamic than within the congregation as to how we conduct our business, how we meet for worship.
Well, and how engaged your congregation can be in community affairs.
Right. Yeah. So I have people that say what's happening in Minneapolis has no effect on me whatsoever. And then I have other people saying, yeah, I live right across the highway from what's happening.
Right.
And as a pastor, then that dynamic is, to me, it's a welcome challenge.
I think so. But it is a challenge.
Right.
Because it's not like you can say, well, look at the people right outside our door.
Right. Well, and as an example, then I want to go march. I want to be a part of the protest.
I kind of figured you did.
Yeah. I want to be there because that's just my nature. It's how I'm wired. However, I'm a father and I'm a pastor and I'm a husband. And therefore, my first call is to serve them.
Yeah, you're not welcoming.
Right. So,
that.
Hey, Annie, take care of the kids. And hey, church, I'll be busy Sunday. I'm going to go protest. It sucks, to be blunt. For me, it sucks because I can't do both. But that ultimately I understand and have accepted that, no, God gave me this vocation probably to stop me from doing a lot of things that I don't need to do, but I want to do.
Whereas if the protesters were literally out in front of the church, you'd be there.
I'd be there 100%.
Because that's a different situation then.
Right. And so all I do then is I have friends who are right there in the middle of it, and I have teammates who are right in the middle of it. And I'm always talking with them about this and saying, if you need a place, I'm here for you. If you need me to come to you, I'll come to you. Because that's what, in the present tense, like we were talking about, in my relationship with these people, that's what I've been called to do right now, is to simply say, I'll be there to pick you up and help you if you need me. Otherwise, I can't be there in the midst of the fray with you because I have these other responsibilities. I have to watch over my family. I have to take care of my congregation right now because, on top of everything else, the shelter-at-home orders and the executive orders from my governor have made it nearly impossible for me to have a congregation right now.
Yeah.
And that ultimately then I have the two kingdoms clashing against each other. And even though I want to go march, I'm called to be the shepherd of my congregation.
Well, I mean, like we said, you approach your life critically, holistically, I hope. And then, but also, there's like risk mitigation, right? You're looking at risk and saying, what's an acceptable risk in this situation?
Yeah, right.
And those things, and that's a dynamic as well. It's not a static thing. It changes all the time. Every day, you wake up and say,
now what?
What am I willing to do today?
Right.
How far can we go today? And maybe you can go a little bit further than you could before. Maybe you can't. Maybe you have to retreat, And that's not a judgment, pro or con. It's just a matter of
fall down, get back up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And do what's best, in the moment, what and then you can judge it. I guess you can judge retroactively. We can look back on this and say, well, we did this right or did that wrong.
Everybody can.
Maybe.
That's why it's a loser's gambit to do that.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't really amount to much.
No. Again, look back, learn from it, move forward. Don't live in the past. But it also goes to the point that when we talk about this, maybe the fact that we don't talk about this often enough in the church is why I don't see a lot of churches having a clear mission in this sense. And that
not equipped to respond to it at all.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Not able to pivot. So we see a lot of the institutional thinking going on right now, like how are we supposed to save our church and how are we supposed to have worship when we can't meet like we used to? Or you have people accepting the lie of the new normal without thinking through what freight that carries within it and why political leaders, for example, are floating that term out all the time. This is the new normal. And I think this goes to, like I think you noted the other day when we were talking, this is why Jesus says we are to be as innocent as doves, but as wise as serpents.
Right.
Because he says, I will send you out as sheep amongst wolves. And as Malcolm X noted in what I read to you earlier, one side of the political spectrum are wolves and the other side are foxes.
Yeah.
One just snarl at you and want to eat you. The other side smiles at you and then eats you.
Yeah. And day to day, I mean, the particular wolf or fox is going to change.
Right.
And that's that adaptability and or just recognition and self-criticism and, just look around and observe and don't let it just, linger there. So, So there's our show.
Go to the cross. Go to the cross. Go to the cross. Go to Christ. Oh, and that's what I was going to say. Lastly, then, for me, this is why every day I pray for strength, that the Lord would give me strength, because I don't know what I need strength for. I just know I need strength. So therefore I pray, give me the strength to do what it is that you would have me do today. Versus give me the strength to protest. Give me the strength to be a father. Give me the strength to do this. Rather just say, listen, I don't know what you're going to call me to within my vocation today, but whatever it is, I need you to give me the strength to get through it because I can't do this.
It's not on you. Never was.
And never was, exactly. And that's the posture of prayer. The posture of prayer is to literally, that's why you're praying, is to say, this isn't on me and it never was. Therefore, that being said, you're responsible for me and for this.
Yeah.
So you gave me this vocation. You gave me these vocations. So now I'm going to need you to show up and lead me through this because I don't know what is
like the psalmist says, why are you sleeping?
Right. Exactly.
Rouse yourself,
so
Lord.
Pray a lot right now. Pray with others right now. Do that. Pray for justice, whatever God's justice will be in the end. Pray for love. More than anything, pray that we can love each other and be kind to each other and help each other.
I don't see any other way out. I mean, that's the point.
No.
It's like trying to do this through whether it's vigilante justice or it's protesting or rioting or what. Those are all probably by nature destructive.
Or even legislating it.
That's not, and that's not necessarily constructive either.
No.
That's a weak response.
Sure.
We're talking about changing hearts. And that's the Lord's doing.
Exactly. So there you go. Good, bad, or indifferent. Thank you so much for listening once again and supporting the podcast. And we'll be back more than likely, God willing, and this creek don't rise. We'll be back with a brand new episode. Maybe we'll read MLK. Who knows?
Maybe. We'll see.
Again, by this time next week, I'm sure that the aliens will have returned and there will be T-Rexes running down my street. So
the news cycle will shift a little bit. Probably.
You think? We love you. We'll see you. Peace.